Okay, welcome back. Let's see. It was a couple weeks ago at this point that I made a video about, here's the sketch, this piece. I was doing lightboxing and penciling. You might remember it. If you didn't watch it, I'll link it somewhere over here. But I mentioned in the video that I would do a follow-up if you were interested, and it seemed like you were. So here we go. This is going to be the inking video. Here's the piece that we're talking about. I'll give you a look here and then a closer look as well. I'm really happy with the way this came out. As I'll explain in this video, I had a plan for it for sure, but I made sure along the whole process, I really stayed open to ideas and anything that might sort of happen as the piece was coming together. And because of that, I think there's a certain spontaneity and energy to this piece that I was hoping to really maintain throughout. I spoke about it in the last video when it comes to lightboxing and transferring a sketch onto a new sheet of paper. The hardest thing to do is to retain that same kind of energy that you had in the sketch. Well, in many ways, the same can be true when you transition from the pencils to the inks. The great thing about penciling is that pencils are very suggestive. You can build up in gradients, and in a way, the more you pencil and erase, sometimes the better the piece looks because it sort of creates this kind of like energy on the page. There's all these different sketchy lines, and then the eye kind of makes sense of everything as you take in the whole piece. But suddenly when you put ink down, it becomes all about contrast. It's really either black or white. In a lot of ways, penciling is nice because you can kind of hide behind certain scribbly lines, whereas when you're inking, things become very stark. And then that's sort of the thing that I think can be scary for a lot of us when we're inking a penciled piece. But in the same way that when I'm lightboxing my sketch, I try to stay in the frame of mind that these are brand new lines. This is a new drawing. I'm not trying to completely trace and mimic the sketch lines that I put down. Otherwise, it becomes like a photocopy of a photocopy. In that same frame of mind, I'm thinking the same thing when I'm inking. These are really the final lines. As far as the black and white lines go on the piece, this is it. All those pencil lines are going to be erased underneath anyway. So instead of trying to very, very closely trace those lines underneath, again, same with the lightboxing, I'm using the penciling underneath as really just a guide. And then I'm inking on top of that as if it's a brand new piece, which it kind of is. I've actually had this one particular thought process behind inking for a while, and then I heard Dan Panosian, the amazing comic book artist, say this. He said the same thing, and it was kind of like validating because that's the same exact way I was thinking about inking for myself too, which is that he goes about inking his pencils as if he's a separate artist who's correcting the penciler's art. The penciler, though, is him. And for a while, I've sort of had that frame of mind as well, which is that when I'm inking, I'm essentially correcting my own pencils. I'm cleaning things up, finessing things, catching mistakes that were in the pencils. You know, if you look at old comics, like Silver Age stuff, oftentimes they would refer to the inker as the finisher. And I think that's actually like a really accurate term for what inking is. You're really just like finishing the drawing. The drawing was started with the pencils, and now you're taking it to completion. You're not just darkening the lines.
You're certainly not tracing.
You're finishing what was started, finishing the idea. So I try to kind of keep that frame of mind when I'm inking. I love the inking process personally. It's always been the most fun part of the process for me. And I think a lot of it is because I've always been a fan of the type of artists and inkers who go about inking in more of like a finishing kind of approach. I made a video a while ago about Joe Kubert. He has a whole video from a long time ago from his correspondence school all about inking. And I sort of made like a commentary video about that video. But I made reference to the fact that instead of inking, he's really just drawing with ink. And a lot of my favorite comic artists and illustrators have that kind of approach where they're drawing with ink as opposed to like inking. So all that is to say that I was really taking a lot of those ideas into this piece when I was inking it. A lot of this stuff sort of just happened on the fly. I pretty much inked and penciled this piece at the same time. I don't always do that, but for a piece like this that for me had a lot of different moving parts, and to sort of just labor over the whole thing in pencil first and then attack it with ink, that didn't really appeal to me with this piece as much. So I separated it into inking and penciling and kind of going back and forth. And I feel like that approach really kept the life in this piece and kind of kept the spontaneity alive. So I mentioned in the last video when I was penciling that I was really having trouble with these two characters, just getting their body language and their expressions and the tilt of their heads right. And I was really laboring over it, erasing so much that at one part, the face of the woman, I feel like I was like that area of the page, I was just like wearing out so much. And then at a certain point, I decided to take my own advice, which is just to kind of stop. I got it to a point where I could see the potential of the drawing underneath, but it wasn't like perfectly penciled and perfectly figured out, but the structure was there. The anatomy was correct. That's what I was really laboring over. There was something off about the anatomy and I couldn't let that go. But once I got it right, I had two choices. I could continue finessing it with pencil or jump in with ink and kind of further develop the gesture of both of those characters. And that's what I did. It's always a little bit nerve-wracking, that's for sure, because the last thing you want to do is mess it up in the inking stage. You know, as well as I know, that ink can sometimes be a little bit nerve-wracking, the sort of permanence of it. And so with that being said, once I was able to get the inking of or at least the outlines of the figures and the Vespa down, I felt like very fast the piece started to come together. I kind of needed to just delineate between inked lines and sketchy lines. I was in that like gray area. Suddenly, once I started putting ink down, those characters and this story started to really kind of come to life. Very quickly though, the next challenge became the backgrounds. And although in the sketch that I was working off of, the backgrounds were roughed in and the overall composition and perspective was there, it was still very, very gestural and there wasn't a lot of detail or specificity in terms of exactly what kind of buildings they were, what type of windows they were, all that stuff. And because this piece for me is very like imaginative, I've never been to this place, but I feel like I've been there in my mind. It's kind of one of those things. I see this scene and this environment very clearly, but it's no particular place in particular. So I'm sort of just drawing and creating from a pure place of imagination, but I want it to be based in reality. I want it to feel like it's a real place. To better help me with this though, I do what I often do, which is just look for reference. Using reference material for me is more of like an inspiration type of thing, rather than finding the exact photo and then just copying that. Oftentimes, I like to look at a lot of different photos just to kind of like educate and familiarize myself with whatever that thing that I'm trying to draw is. And then I might take a little piece from that, a little piece from that, and then fill in the gaps with my imagination. And that's exactly what I did with these buildings and this whole sort of background. I went to one of my favorite websites, which is Pinterest. Pinterest is like this endless rabbit hole of reference material. It's pretty great for artists. I find a lot of my stay warm poses there as well. But I was just looking up photos of what I feel like this environment would look like and would feel like. And then I started looking up the way other artists might have sketched these same type of environments as well. I got really inspired by the loose gestural interpretation that some of these artists were creating in their pieces. And it really put me in the frame of mind as though I'm like in this scene, I'm behind the camera. That's the way I was approaching this in many ways, as if I was there and doing like a life drawing in my sketchbook. So because of that, there was a perspective put in place, but I didn't take my ruler out and start doing vanishing lines. I kind of had it mapped out in a rough and loose way, very much the way I would if I were drawing on location. Because again, I want it to feel real. I want it to feel like it's something that I'm seeing through my own eyes. I should say too about reference, I mentioned that I use reference in a very piecemeal kind of way. But for certain things, for instance, like this Vespa, that was very much a direct copy of a Vespa picture that I found that was in the perfect angle of what I needed for this image. So that was very much as though I was just sort of like life drawing that Vespa, as if it was standing right in front of me. And for things like inanimate objects, architecture, buildings, those are not my strong points when it comes to drawing. I really love the body language. I love gestural stuff. I love drawing faces and expressions. So it's the inorganic objects that are challenging for me. And that's where reference really helps. But again, it's my interpretation of it. I'm not trying to copy and make a photo replica of that drawing. I'm really trying to just interpret it through my lines and through my style. Using reference and working with reference is, I think, a skill in and of itself. I could go on and talk about reference for a while. In fact, if you would like to see me make a video just about using reference, comment down below and let me know. So the whole like wash thing, for instance, that just sort of happened once I started blocking in the backgrounds. I was penciling and penciling, a lot of erasing, a lot of trying to figure out those background buildings. And then I just decided that let me water down some ink and get some gestural lines on there. And then that sort of turned into like this whole wash thing. And then once the wash happened, I used this nifty calligraphy pen that I really been enjoying so much. I talked about this in my recent Tools of the Trade or Art Supplies video. And it's a Sailor pen. I forget exactly what it's called. I'll put it down here. Definitely check out that last video as well. I go into depth with all of these pens and brushes that I was using in this piece. But it's super cool. And because it's hard to control this pen very, very precisely, that's kind of the thing that I really like about it. It gives you this like instant sort of like spontaneity to the line. And I feel like that really lent itself for the building. So then at that point, I pretty much had the outlines of the figures and the Vespa, and then I had this wash in the background with the buildings, and I decided, oh, maybe I'll just start adding a wash to the whole thing for consistency. For a minute there, I was almost gonna only do wash for the backgrounds and then just have the figures pop out and not be in wash. But I felt like there was sort of like an inconsistency there. So then I started to add wash to the figures and the foreground, and that was scary because I felt so good about the line work on those characters that I didn't want to mess it up with the wash. But again, it's sort of like that tightrope thing. It could go one way or the other, and that kind of nerve-wracking energy, I think, sometimes lends itself to preventing this piece or any piece you're working on from sort of like going dull. And then suddenly from there, I said, okay, I guess this piece is going to be wash with ink lines. And that's not how I intended it, but being open to different things that happen throughout the process is something that I'm much more open to now, especially from these last couple of years of having like a very regular sketchbook practice. I feel like so much of what I've been doing in my sketchbooks and learning from in my sketchbooks, I'm applying to my finished work as well. So then from there, it was just this more of a back and forth between penciling and inking and refining and inking some more, throwing a wash down, reacting to that. I worked on this in installments. And when I'm working traditionally, one of the things that I really like about it is that when you come back to look at it after like an hour or two, or sometimes the next day, it's almost like all the materials that you use, like they have to have some time to like seep into the paper. Like sometimes I'll put something down and I don't know how I feel about it at first, or maybe sometimes I'm not even crazy about it at first. And then it needs some time for like the whole thing to kind of like marinate and set. And then suddenly, it just sort of like happens. The whole thing kind of comes together and you're able to see it and go, oh wow, that's actually kind of cool. For me, things like that never really happen when I'm working digitally. Digital definitely has its benefits and I use it as well, but as far as like spontaneity goes and things happening right on the page, I feel like nothing can really match using traditional tools. So yeah, like I said, I'm really happy with the way this piece came out. I'm trying to think of any other things that are worth mentioning about this process. I guess some of the specifics would be, this is an 11 by 17 piece. This was done on Bristol board paper, vellum finish. I mentioned it in the last video about this piece that I did the sketch digitally and then I printed it out at 11 by 17, put this underneath, light boxed it. I used a variety of different pens and brushes and brush pens. I find that creating sort of like energy and life on the page really helps when I use a variety of different materials. Instead of just using like one pen or one brush, the more the merrier, I feel, when it comes to inking especially. I'll leave links down below in the description if you want direct links where you could get any of the supplies that I used in this video. And please do comment below if you have any specific questions about some of the pens or brushes or whatever I used in this piece. Okay, so this piece is actually not finished. I intend on creating this piece as a full color image. So the next obvious step is to color this piece. I will actually be coloring it digitally in Photoshop. It's a nice blend of the two that I like in my process, which is creating black and white art traditionally and then coloring it digitally. Increasingly more and more, I'm doing everything on the page, including the color. But for this piece, I'm gonna stick with that approach that I've been doing for so long, and I'm gonna color this digitally. I definitely wanna apply the same thinking and frame of mind behind the coloring that I did with all stages of this piece so far, which is to be open to surprises, happy accidents, and let things just sort of happen. So I'm really excited to go to the last stage of this piece and bring it to its final iteration. All right, I think that's all I got. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the whole behind the scenes look at the inking process behind this, as well as some of my thought process behind this. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. Like in all my videos, I really do like to continue the conversation of the video in the comment section. Also, links and all that other kind of stuff will be in the description as well. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.